Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at the AEI. We are excited to have you all here today. As some of you know, the Poverty Studies program at AEI has done extensive work over the past few years on the federal government's safety net programs and how encouraging education, requiring and rewarding work, and supporting marriage and the family can help lift low-income Americans out of poverty. And today we are excited to be discussing a new report from Brad Wilcox and Wendy Wang on how these factors play out in the new generation of millennials and how that affects their economic futures. Wendy and Brad will introduce us to the findings of their new report entitled Millennials and the Success Sequence: How do Education, Work, and Marriage Affect Poverty and Financial Success Among Millennials? I'm happy to see there's several millennials in the room, and maybe even younger than millennials. So we like a young audience, and we're very especially pleased that you're here today. I'm going to introduce Wendy and Brad, and then they're going to present, and then we're going to have a panel of respondents and a discussion with Wendy and Brad. After that, then we're going to take a short break and then have a second panel with a group of especially important experts from a younger generation, along with educators, and then we'll conclude our session. So for now, I'm just going to introduce Wendy and Brad, and then I'll introduce the rest of our panelists later. So Wendy Wang is the Director of Research at the Institute for Family Studies. Dr. Wang is a former senior researcher at Pew Research Center, where she conducted research on marriage, gender, work, and family life in the United States. She was the lead author of the Pew Research Center report, Breadwinner Moms, among other Pew reports. W. Bradford Wilcox is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project, inaugurated in the fall of 2013. The research project explores the links between family structure and economic growth in 20 countries around the world. Dr. Wilcox is also an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Projects. So Wendy, start us off. Thank you very much, and again, welcome to AEI.
Let me see if I can find the slide. Okay. Well, thank you, Robert. Good morning. I'm so excited to be here and share some very important findings from our new report. As you know, the millennials are the largest generation in our country today, and they're also the most diverse and most educated generation. Today, we're focusing on millennials' success. Using a nationally represented data that tracks young adults from teenage years, we look at the different paths that millennials take on their journey to adulthood and explore the ones that are linked to a more prosperous life when reaching the prime years of young adulthood. These millennials were born 1980 and between 1980 and 1984, and they're the first group of millennials who reach young adulthood. We have two key questions here. First, is success sequence still relevant? Second, what about marriage? In an age when more and more young adults are delaying marriage or perhaps forgo marriage, is marriage still relevant for today's millennials? So marriage and parenthood are the two traditional milestones of adulthood. The question is, which comes first? Compared with boomers at the same age, millennials are less likely to marry first and more likely to take the route of have a child first. At ages 28 to 34, 40% of millennials have married without first having a child, compared with 67% of baby boomers. At the same time, millennials are also more likely than boomers to delay both marriage and children. By ages 28 to 34, nearly 3 in 10 millennials have never been married and do not have children. So among millennials who do have children, which is about 60% of them at ages 28 to 34, more than half of them had their first child before marriage. I'm referring to the slice of the pie on the right. So you can see two groups are included here. One group, about a quarter of millennial parents, had a baby first and then get married. And the other group are still unmarried as of the ages 28 to 34. Again, the share of boomer parents who had children before marriage was much lower. Only 25% of them did so. So, which path is linked to a better economic status when reaching adulthood? As shown in this chart, millennials' economic fortunes differ sharply depending on whether the marriage or the baby comes first in their lives. Among young adults who put marriage first, which is the first bar on the left, 36% had made to the middle income when they reach adulthood, and half of them had made to the top third of income distribution. So in total, 86% of them are in the middle or top tier of the income distribution. On the other hand, close to half of the millennials who had a baby first, regardless of their current marital status, they're in the bottom third of the income distribution when reaching adulthood. And the millennials who delayed both marriage and parenthood are almost equally distributed in the three income groups. You may say, oh, wait a minute, maybe the young adults who delay marriage, who put marriage first are just different from the others. You're right. Some young adults are more likely to follow marriage first than others, and some of their characteristics are linked to higher income. For example, we know that in general, young adults who are white, college educated, and grew up from higher income families are more likely to take the route of marriage first. However, after we control for a range of characteristics, including work status, education, and demographic characteristics, we find that the order of marriage and children is, in millennials' lives, is significantly associated with their financial well-being when reaching adulthood. So, since we have analyzed all the different arrangements the young adults have taken when reaching adulthood, so I want to give you the whole picture here. It's a little busy, but bear with me. The slide shows the percent of young adults in the middle or higher income tier by their income arrangements. From this slide, you can see there's no doubt that family status is related to income status. At the top of the bar chart, we find that those who are married and childless have the highest family income. This is a group that follow the marriage first route. They just don't have children yet. Among this group, nearly 7 in 10 are in the top third of the income bracket, and the other 24% are in the middle income group. So we're talking about 93% of these young adults are in the middle or upper income groups. Coming in second economic success are the millennials who married before having children and are still currently married. Over 8 in 10 millennials in this group have made to the middle or higher income groups. At the bottom are the millennials who have children but have never been married, and those who are currently divorced and had their child before marriage. So just give you an idea about how the sequence of marriage and parenthood plays in this picture. Here I circle two groups, both currently married, but one had a baby after marriage and the other had a baby before marriage. And so you can see the group that had baby after marriage are doing much better financially than the other group. So far, I've only covered one of the 3 steps in the success sequence. Let me move on to the other 2 steps and introducing our success sequence measure. As you can see, we pretty much followed what Haskins and Sawhill did in 2009. There's 3 steps: getting at least a high school degree and work and marry before having any children. The adjustment we made was that if a young adult were in college or graduate school in their mid-20s and they don't have a full-time job, we consider them follow the work step. So let's take a look at how millennials are doing. At mid-20s, 91% of them have graduated from high school, and 71% were engaged in work or educational activities. And as we already shown, that 40% married first. And also, there is 27% of millennials who haven't been married and are childless at ages 28 to 34. We call this group, quote-unquote, on-track group, as long as they have followed the education or work steps. These are individual level measures, and when we combine all 3 factors, the share of young adults who follow all 3 steps or are on track is 50%. So throughout the report, we found strong evidence that the success sequence is linked to a much lower chance of being in poverty and higher chance of moving into middle or upper income bracket. This chart shows the share of young adults in poverty after completing each step of success sequence. As a reference, for young adults who did not follow any of the steps, 53% are in poverty. I did not show it here, I just give you a reference. So for millennials who have completed at least high school, but they don't have a full-time job and they did not marry before having children, 30% are in poverty. For those who managed to have at least a high school degree and a full-time job, and 16% are poor. Finally, only 3% of millennials who followed all 3 steps are poor by the time they reach their late 20s and early 30s. In other words, 90% of millennials ages 28 to 34 who have followed the success sequence avoided poverty. In fact, nearly 90% of these young adults are in the middle or higher income tier when reaching adulthood. Again, the results from our regression analysis suggest that the association between success sequence and young adults' financial success is robust after control for other factors related to economic status, including a college degree and AFQT scores. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wendy. So I think as you've been hearing Wendy talk about the connection between the success sequence and millennial financial outcomes, as well as the links between marriage and millennial financial outcomes, probably some of you are, again, they're wondering whether or not it's really the success sequence that's sort of driving the story, or whether it's kind of some underlying advantage, or to kind of put it in a different way, in a more social science way, perhaps young adults who are kind of embedded in particular social structures are more likely to be thriving today. And so we talk about this in the report by saying that, quote, social structure matters in predicting which types of young adults live according to the success sequence norms. So for instance, young adults who are coming from better neighborhoods, better schools, with better educated parents are more likely to be following the sequence. And we can see this in the next slide. So what this shows us is that younger adults who are coming from higher income families are about twice as likely to be following the sequence compared to younger adults from lower income families. And so again, the question is this really all about kind of underlying social structural advantage? And in the report, we acknowledge that that's indeed part of the story. We suggest it's not the only part of the story, that we think also that things like culture matter. that the kinds of values, norms, dispositions that you encounter in your social world, among your family and your friends is also important. We mentioned, for instance, that Mormons across a range of different socioeconomic positions are more likely to marry kind of above and beyond their social structural positions. So that's sort of one salient example of sort of culture at work. We also argue, though, too, that people generally, and of course there are exceptions for people who are maybe suffering severe depression, for instance, but that generally speaking, people have agency. People can make choices about their behavior, about their future. They can embrace certain virtues. They can avoid certain vices. And that shapes their ability to do well in school, to do well in the labor force, and to make good choices about marriage and parenthood. So we think we can't lose sight of sort of the role of culture and agency in this whole picture as well. And so we also wanted just to kind of mention that this idea that the success sequence is relevant not just for more, sort of affluent young adults or affluent young adults from more privileged backgrounds, can be seen in how the success sequence plays out for young adults from lower income families and for black millennials as well. What we can see here is that when you look at young adults who are coming from lower income families, families whose income falls in the bottom third of the sort of the income ladder, is if they follow the success sequence, they're much less likely to be poor compared to their peers who miss one or two or all three steps associated with the sequence. You can see here again that young adults who are coming from low-income backgrounds are much less likely to be poor compared to their peers who are missing one or two steps, or their peers who are missing all three steps in the data. And a similar story obtains too for African Americans. Again, African Americans are less likely to be avoiding poverty compared to other Americans. But if they are following the steps, they've got the sort of the lowest odds of being poor compared to their African American peers who've missed one or two steps or have missed all three steps. So again, we think this suggests that the sequence is perhaps related to the well-being of not just kids or young adults coming from affluent homes, but young adults sort of across the spectrum. Now, one other kind of, I think, logical concern or criticism about this idea of the success sequence is, well, is it really, just about kind of education and work? Isn't it the case that kind of once you've taken care of getting a decent education and getting a decent profession or job, that's really that's driving these findings? And when we looked at sort of the unique effects of marriage in a multivariate context, we found that concern was not legitimate. Or was there some kind of additional power linked to getting married before having any children in terms of millennials' financial well-being? And this next slide gives you sort of some sense of how this sort of is playing out. Again, so young adults who are marrying first are less likely to be poor than young adults who are putting the baby first. And in a multivariate context, and this table is probably pretty small for all of you, but what it basically shows us is that once we control for things like education, work status, race and ethnicity, AFQT scores, and your family income growing up, there's still a net effect of marrying before having any children compared to putting the baby before the wedding. And finally, in terms of kind of making sense of this, so what is it about education, work, and marriage that matters for millennials? And a couple of just basic points. One, when it comes to education, obviously, kind of getting some skills, getting some knowledge, having access to particular social networks helps to, I think, account for the education effect. A second point to make is that when it comes to sort of using your 20s wisely, millennials who are working full-time are going to be obviously getting more hours, getting more experience, probably getting access to more promotions, and also making connections that can help them, not just in that moment, but down the road professionally. And then third, when it comes to marriage, having access often to a second income, being able to also enjoy economies of scale. And then the third point I would make here about marriage is we know that millennials who put marriage before parenthood enjoy more stability and are therefore less likely to have kids across multiple households. And you might not be thinking about what's the significance of that. Well, the issue there, obviously, is if you have kids in multiple households, you're more likely to be paying child support, and of course, your kids and oftentimes, their parents are more likely to be suffering financially. So this is one more way in which the marriage sequencing may be connected to the financial well-being of today's millennials. So to conclude, I think for those who are skeptical that the success sequence matters, it's striking that so many of today's financially successful millennials, as this slide here suggests, appear to be following it. And so many millennials who are floundering financially have not been following it. Indeed, I'd hazard a guess that most critics of the idea that the success sequence matters have themselves followed it. What critics need to acknowledge, I think, is that education, work, and marriage continue to be fundamental pillars of the American dream, even for a new generation of younger adults. What supporters, I think, need to acknowledge, however, is that this sequence, as we can see today, is more likely to be out of reach for younger adults from poor and working class communities. So it's for that reason, as we think about kind of, where do we go from here, that we suggest a number of different measures to strengthen young adults' connections to education, work, and marriage. On the education front, we would stress the idea that most young adults, even today, do not graduate from college. And given that, we think that we should be focusing more on apprenticeships and more on technical education in high schools and community college. We think, for instance, the LEAP Act, co-sponsored by Senators Cory Booker and Tim Scott, is an example of the kinds of policy measures that should be pursued in an effort to strengthen our educational offerings to younger adults who are not on the college track. When it comes to work, we think that expanding the ITC would be helpful, or pursuing a different strategy that would be about expanding wage subsidies without regard to the character or context of your household. So one idea is to take a wage subsidy equal to 1/2 the difference between the employee's hourly wage and the median hourly wage, to expand the financial returns to work, particularly for Americans at the lower end of the income ladder. And then on the cultural front, we think that more could be done to publicize the value of the success sequence and of marriage in particular. And for skeptics of this idea, what we would do is we would just basically point to the success the national campaign to reduce teen and unplanned pregnancy has had in this domain. We've seen teen pregnancy come down more than 50% since early 1990s. And we would attribute that in part to the work the campaign has done, working in coalition with a variety of stakeholders, from MTV to public schools, to publicize this idea that you should wait until after being a teenager to have kids. So we can kind of take that same kind of approach in publicizing the value of the success sequence to a rising generation of younger Americans. These three ideas are just some examples of the kinds of public and private efforts that need to be taken. More generally, it's imperative that policymakers, civic leaders, and business executives recognize that strengthening the appeal and the accessibility of the success sequence depends upon building effective communication channels with young adults, as well as improving the economic and cultural foundations of work and marriage for a rising generation of young adults. Without such efforts, we can expect that all too many young men and women will not follow the success sequence's path away from poverty and towards the American dream. Thank you.
Panel discussion now. Ready to take our seats? So we have a very distinguished group of experts and panelists to respond to this findings in these reports and to get, I hope, a lively discussion about its implications. And I want to thank them all for being here. And I should say, the first person I'm going to introduce all three, and then they're going to go one right after the other, and then Wendy and Brad will be able to respond, and then we'll have a discussion. I've already got a couple questions, and people are handing me questions, which I am going to spring on you. So of our three next responders, the first is Ron Haskins, and I need to say something about this. This idea of the success sequence, graduate from high school, get married before you have a child, and get a job, really originated with Ron Haskins. Ron Haskins and his co-author, Bell Sawhill, wrote the first paper on this, and he is the founder of that concept. And that's a great thing, Ron, and we're glad that you did that. You are also the Cabot Family Chair of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institute and a senior consultant at N.A. Casey Foundation. And Ron is someone who I have known for years and is one of our town's and our country's greatest experts on these issues. Annie Lowry is a staff writer for The Atlantic and covers economic policy, in particular anti-poverty and social welfare programs. And she's writing a book on a topic that's very popular here at AI, universal basic income for Crown, very popular among some people at AI. And then third up is Ian Rowe, who is the CEO of Public Prep, a network of single-sex elementary and middle public schools that prepare students to earn a degree from a four-year university. Previously, he was the Deputy Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he worked to increase college completion rates among low-income young adults. So with those introductions, I'll start with you, Ron, and then Annie, and then you, Ian. Ron?
Okay, can we make that slide come up?
Yes, if you push the button, there it is. There it is.
Okay. I am not a millennial.
Clearly.
I'm not guilty of all these horrible things millennials do. My kids are, though, all of them. I'm going to make 4 brief points. Robert has generously given each of us 5 minutes to make profound points, so I'm going to do about a point a minute. This is the original success sequence. I just wanted you to see it. We did it, Bell Sawhill and I did it first in 2005. We've done it many times. It's based on Census Bureau data, and it shows roughly what Brad has been talking about. And I still am amazed that this is actually the status of people in the United States. This is what actually happens to people who follow all 3 rules or people who follow none of the rules or 1 or 2 of the rules. We looked at all that. And they're just enormous differences. So I thought it'd be good for you to see that. I also want you to know we have a long technical paper that we've been severely criticized, especially by the left, for these analyses because they say we say they're causal. They are not causal. They're correlations. I think, in fact, in the real world, they do contribute greatly, and there's a separate literature on each of these 3 factors, work, marriage, and family, that show that they are causal. It's very difficult to do with marriage because we can't randomly assign people to marriage and not marriage. But there's still really good studies, quasi-experimental studies. Sarah McClanahan, no one has ever accused Sarah of being on the right, and probably the country's greatest expert on marriage and family composition, is very clearly in the corner that says marriage is crucial. So the original success sequence created all these arguments, Brad, that you now have to figure out good answers for, and we're still trying to do it. Secondly, and my second point is correlation is not causation, we admit that, but the most effective argument against it, I think, is that we have a separate literature on all 3 of these factors. At least work and education are definitely causally related, not just with poverty and middle class, but with economic mobility, which is probably the most important thing that we need to do in America is promote economic mobility, which we have not done a good job of doing. Third, if we want to intervene in these things, we do intervene. We spend $1 trillion a year between the federal government and the states on social programs, and we are not making much progress. We can see that very clearly now because we have tons of analyses. Something like 80 to 90% of the programs we use are not successful. We have very good studies to show this. So we need to come up with new ideas, and what I think we need to do, everything Brad mentioned I think is good. We're doing something along the lines of everything that he mentioned. I think we need to focus on repeated interventions with low-income kids and kids who have disadvantages throughout the period of development. My colleague Bell Sawhill, who is equally, what did that say? 3 minutes, okay. My colleague Bell Sawhill, we worked together to do this original analysis, has a thing called the social genome. And what she proposes is a series of interventions beginning in early childhood, actually during the prenatal period, up through adulthood. And she shows modeling now, again, it's not causal, it's modeling, but they are cumulative. They do make a difference when you do them together. And I think we need to do that. I personally think that we could end some of the programs we're doing now, or at least cut them back, and use the money more effectively. We would not necessarily need to spend a lot of new money, but we have to do what heretofore was thought to be impossible, and that is actually end programs that don't work. That's something we need to do and use the money more effectively. And then finally, I want to say something about marriage and hectoring. This point, I think the right is vulnerable on. I think we cannot make progress if we go out and say, you should be married. And if we lecture all these young kids here and say, boy, you better get married. It doesn't work. And I depart a little bit from the comparison with the national campaign on teen pregnancy, because there you can be much more directive. You can say to kids, don't have a baby out of marriage. It's really a lousy idea. And guess what? Ministers say that, parents say that, teachers say that, and we have conducted, the national campaign, several surveys that show that kids agree with that. Like 85% of kids it's a bad idea to have and as a result of that, since 1991, teen birth rates have declined every year except 2, and during that period, get this, they've declined 60%. 60%. I don't think we've had that success with any other public policy, and I think a big part of the reason is because we're all in agreement on it. Well, we're not all in agreement on a marriage. This is going to be a battle. There are a lot of people who think, I don't want to be married, I'm not going to get married. A lot of people who were married are not married now say, I'm never going to do that again. Those who do, it's what do they say? It's the triumph of hope over experience to get married a second time. I want you to know that's false. I've been married twice, and the second one is better. So hectoring is not going to work. So what we need to do is have community-based organizations that deliver this message. And in the public part of the campaign, we need to have a lot of humor and a lot of testimony from people that kids respect. It just cannot be hectoring. It's got to be. And the product that we're trying to sell is spectacular. It makes a huge difference, especially for kids. And that's the last thing I want to say. That should be the main emphasis because it is for the kids. And kids who come from married couple families are superior in every single measurable respect. And I suspect lots of things we can't.
On average.
Oh,
Statistically.
thank you for that addition.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just talking about everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, it's too late. Anyway, so I think we can do something. I think we have a lot of evidence that there are things that we do that are successful, and if we do a bunch of them together, and especially if we have community involvement and figure out good ways to convey the marriage message, we can really promote the success sequence and, most importantly, promote economic mobility in the United States.
Thank you, Ron. Annie?
So thank you so much to AEI. Thank you to Brad and Wendy for writing a really interesting paper. I wanted to take a moment to appreciate millennials who are much maligned. They are doing a lot of things right in a pretty hard economic climate. They are delaying marriage. Their rates of childbearing in their teen years are quite low and have been declining. They are going to college. They're graduating from high school at much higher numbers than their parents did. They're doing a lot of things right. They are trying to follow this success sequence. And I think it's worth, taking a moment. I think especially given that there's such negativity around, oh, if you stopped buying avocado toast, you'd be able to buy a house, and like, why don't you move out of your parents' basement? And and the economic climate that they are graduating into is really hard. right? We have seen median wage stagnation. We've seen housing prices being really challenging for them. We've seen them struggling with the burden of student debt. All of these things are kind of orthogonal to the issues that we're talking about here, but I think it's worth noting that one good part of this story is that millennials believe this, and to a large extent, they are trying to follow this sequence, right? I do think that cultural message has actually sunk in really, really well. And so I think that both Wendy and Brad gestured to the way in which the most interesting thing about this, I think, is the degree to which it's a chicken or egg problem, right? Are these three characteristics describing, are they attributes of people who have other advantages and therefore are more likely to be advantaged themselves, to be higher income, to delay marriage, to delay childbearing until after marriage, to have a good role in the workforce? Or are they causal? And I do think that one thing that the report makes very clear is that it's absolutely both. Right? It is both true that if you come from a higher income family, you are more likely to be going to college, you are more likely to be delaying having children, to be married before you have children, to be either in graduate school or at full-time work when you're in your mid-20s. But it is also true that if you do follow all of these steps, that it is extremely unlikely that you are going to be poor. And so I think that, when you get to the public policy piece of this, and I think it's something that Ron gestured to, we have really low rates of relative economic mobility in this country. Who you are, what kind of family you were born to is very likely to determine a lot of your life course in a way that I don't think that we like to admit. And so I think that to the extent that public policy can be shaping the broader economic architecture here, I think that it's important to note that. But on all three fronts, there are absolutely things that we could do better on in public policy. We do terribly in terms of eliminating child poverty. We have relatively few interventions early in people's lives. We could expand things like preschool and home family visiting partnerships, those type of things that we know are really, really great at improving outcomes for low-income kids. In terms of education, I do think that the cost of college is a really big issue that the United States is facing. I think that the student debt conversation gets it's a little bit strange, right? Because, if you have a ton of student debt, it also probably indicates that you went to college, finished college. But nevertheless, I do think that access and affordability are really big issues. And in terms of childbearing, yes, you can promote marriage, but you can also do things like improving access to contraception, making sure that it's really easy and really cheap for people. I think that we have a lot of evidence that abstinence-only education doesn't really work. And we have a lot of ineffective ways of talking, not just about marriage, but about childbearing. So just wanted to bring that into the conversation as well.
Thank you, Annie.
Sure.
Ian?
Well, thank you and good morning. As Robert said, my name is Ian Rowe. I'm the CEO of Public Prep, which is the nation's only nonprofit network exclusively focused on single-sex schools, all girls and all boys schools. And so my vantage point in this conversation as someone who runs schools is, what do we teach the next generation? What about the kids in schools today? Because if we know that children are likely going to face challenges around poverty or race or economic stagnation, or a new social norm in which record numbers of young adults are having children outside of marriage, in addition to life's normal obstacles, what's the information our scholars need to learn to make decisions that will likely lead to their life success? Right? What's our responsibility as educators to empower our students to gain the personal agency to make the best choices in their lives? So that's my vantage point in this conversation. Quick background on Public Prep. Our first school, Girls Prep Lower East Side, was founded in 2005 as the first and only all-girls public charter school in New York City. Since then, we've grown. We now have all boys and all girls schools, 5 campuses, about 2,000 students in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and in the heart of the South Bronx. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by Kessie Wilson, who's one of our graduating 12th graders, just finished Exeter and is on her way to Yale. Here also is Daisha Rivas, someone who's finishing 8th grade and is going to one of the best high schools in New York City, and Michael Farkash, who's the principal of our Girls Prep Bronx Middle School. You'll be hearing from them in the next panel, but we thought it was very important to have the perspective of young adults to react to all of this information. And I'm very pleased to say that 90% of our 12th graders have been accepted into four-year colleges and universities, which is a wonderful outcome, certainly compared to the normal rate of completion of entry for this demographic. I say this not only because I want to highlight the accomplishments of public prep, I also want to highlight the fact that most of us in education reform are very comfortable championing college and education. Right? We have no issue promoting that it's our expectation and that it's in the best interest of our scholars to be on a path to and through college. There's no taboo around talking about completing your education. Generally, we're also comfortable talking about jobs. You'll often hear, education reformers talking about college and career. It's once we step into this threshold, ed reformers almost never venture into this area. The two other areas that the success sequence suggests are so critical, right? Marriage and childbirth in a certain order. And this is where I hope the education reform community realizes that we have a crucial and unique role to play. I've been writing a series of essays for the Fordham Institute on this topic. But just to give you a sense of why I think this is important. Is there a...
Here.
All right.
Push it that way. Maybe the other way.
Nope. All right.
There you go.
That's a picture of some of our 8th graders graduating. But to give you a sense of why I think this is important, in our last lottery, we had 3,819 families apply for less than 140 open seats for our Boys Prep Bronx and Girls Prep Bronx schools. So it's like fireworks on the 4th of July when we call parents to let them know that their child has won the golden ticket into one of our schools. But it's heartbreaking to tell more than 3,500 families that the best we can do is to put your child on an excruciatingly long wait list. So we made a decision to focus all of our growth in the South Bronx to meet this demand. And as a result, last year, one of the decisions we made was to move our headquarters from lovely Tribeca in Manhattan to move our headquarters to the heart of the South Bronx. And so one of the things that we did to acclimate our staff to the neighborhood, we decided to do a walking tour. And on that walking tour, we saw this huge 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with graffiti lettering. And on the side of it, as you can say, it says, "Who's your daddy?" Right? And it's like almost the ice cream truck. But we were stunned to realize that this is a mobile DNA center, providing a very important service to the community. And so for between $350 and $600, primarily low-income people are going onto this truck to do a paternity test, to answer questions like, who is my father? Is this my sibling? Am I dating my brother? And business, and this is no joke, I mean, perhaps it's funny, but once you realize the reality of this, business is so strong that the owners have now added a second bus, a second truck. And so VH1 actually has done a reality series on the show called Swab Stories. So when I saw this, I realized I had to think very differently about the role of education and what I thought we needed to do. A lot of us have been in this work for a long time who've committed our lives to sort of breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. But clearly now, a lot of this data suggests, typically this has been a conversation just about young people of color, but increasingly the explosion in out-of-wedlock births across race, particularly to women aged 24 and under, is having huge impact on the quality of not only a wide range of outcomes, but particularly in education. This chart shows for each year from 2000 to 2012 the raw number of children born to unmarried women aged 24 and under, and you can see there's a steady pace of between 820 to 1.1 million children every single year being born to women aged 24 and under. That has huge impacts on a whole number of factors. So the reason I find the data compelling around the success sequence is that it actually gives our kids powerful information for how they can navigate a lot of these challenges. Our kids, if you're 7 years old, you can't solve an institutional racism, right? You can't solve these challenges. So, what can you do about it? And, our kids don't have time to wait for systemic racism to be dismantled or for suddenly folks who are practicing implicit or explicit racism to suddenly become unracist, right? So what can they do in the meantime? What do they have control over? And that's why, for us in the education sector, I believe it's incumbent upon us to figure out creative ways to impart this information to our kids.
Okay, thank you, Ian, very much. That was great. All the discussion was wonderful, including the presentation. Brad, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to anything you heard, and then I have a couple questions that get the discussion going.
No, I think all the comments that were made by our panelists, are on the money. I just want to sort of underline again one idea, and that is that I think sometimes, particularly on the side of more progressive circles, there is a reluctance to address issues of family formation. That's a point that was just made by Ian. And yet, I think not only our research, but the research of many other scholars suggests that this is sort of one area where what has traditionally been seen as a kind of a conservative idea or issue or norm has real progressive implications. And so again, if we could sort of figure out a way to make the marriage/family stability issue less partisan and to make it more of a consensual issue in American life, my argument is that that will redound to the benefit of kids from less advantaged or lower income families and communities. So all I'm saying here, I guess, is that if you're really concerned about opportunity in America and equality in America, you can't lose sight of marriage and family as one, but of course not the only factor in fostering more opportunity and more mobility and more social equality in the United States.
One of the things I wanted you to address, and maybe the panelists also to recognize, is that this issue about the success sequence, I think from your findings, applies to folks from multiple races, all races. And the issue of having children before marriage is a significant problem among white families in the United States. And you seem to show that for blacks who follow the success sequence, they do pretty well. Similarly, for whites and others who don't, they do pretty badly, or they are there in that group that's not doing as well. Isn't that true, Brad? I mean, is that one thing that I worry about is this message becomes a message about one particular group and not all groups. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, the slides that we showed today and the figures in the report are indicative of the idea that across racial lines and across class lines, people who follow the sequence are more likely to be flourishing today, and those who are not following the sequence are more likely to be floundering. And of course, the levels vary based upon things like race and ethnicity and the income of your family growing up. But sort of the overall story in terms of the association between the sequence and your odds of flourishing financially today is pretty similar across economic and racial lines. So that's worth.
And then for the group as a whole, go ahead, Ian.
I was going to say there's the chart that's on the screen that shows out of wedlock births by race. I actually think is one of the most extremely important pieces of data that most people should recognize, because, as Robert said, typically there's a focus on this is only an issue affecting kids of color, and as you can see, since the 60s, when marriage was the norm across all races, right? Single digits, about 5%. Only about 5% of kids were born out of wedlock. But starting, when Pat Moynihan in the late 60s wrote his report about the Negro, what we call the Negro family, and at that point, the out-of-wedlock birth rate, crisis levels, was 23%. Right? Today, in the black community, that number is more than 70%. But in the white community, that number is now nearly 30%, far above the crisis levels that Moynihan spoke about in the late 60s. So in my view, this actually creates an opportunity, hopefully, especially within the education reform movement, to realize that what this is highlighting is that these are issues of more of a common humanity, not only specifically driven by race. And hopefully this is a chance for all of us to recognize that issues of family structure have become much more likely determinants of a child's success.
Can I add something very quickly
Sure.
to that? I think everybody probably realizes, but it's good to make sure you do. And that is you get the exact same results, not every point, but the same pattern if you do it by income. So it's not just a racial issue, it's an income issue too. And you see this big increase for low-income families as well. And regardless of how you divide it by quintiles or quartiles or whatever, it goes up, up, up. About the only group that's managed to avoid these kind of family issues is college-educated women.
Right.
Their divorce rates have not changed since the 1980s, and they tend not to have babies outside marriage. In other words, they really follow the success sequence. And the second thing is that I think we ought to realize the people who are most likely to make these mistakes of dropping out of school, of having babies outside marriage, of quitting jobs and not working consistently are exactly the ones that experience all of these problems. And it makes their situation worse. It makes the probability of recovering and having a middle-class job as an adult and staying married and so forth, it makes it worse, all these background factors that apply even more to low-income families than they do to middle-income families, even though, as we pointed out, they do apply to everybody.
And I think that the issue of why aren't millennials getting married, right? Why are they choosing to have children outside of wedlock? I think that there's certainly a cultural component there. I think that there's also an economic component as well. And I think that we don't adequately understand, perhaps, the public policies that could be used to support family formation, better structures of family formation. I think that it's just a very complicated issue that of all of these, I think that I certainly feel like I have the least grip on, right? Getting people to go to college, I think, is in some ways a lot more straightforward than encouraging folks to get married and making sure that they have kind of stable economic structures to do that.
I'm not sure folks in millennials really adds anything to the analysis, because if you do charts, a colleague and I once did a study based on decennial census data, which is a huge sample of everybody in the country, and looking at marriage and non-marital births. And starting in 1970, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, the patterns are they increase consistently. So this is not something that millennials discovered how to make mistakes. More and more Americans have been doing this for half a century. They're less likely to get married. They get married later, which that could be good, and they are more likely to have babies outside marriage. And it just keeps increasing, where at some point it's going to level off. But it's not a new problem. This has been threatening us. The Moynihan paper was 1969. So to give you an idea that we've had this problem for a long time.
But there are two sort of caveats what you just said, Ron. The first is that since 2008, since the recession, there's been no increase in the share of kids born outside of marriage. And this is a dramatic shift in the trajectory of non-marital childbearing. So from the 60s to 2008, almost a consistent year-by-year increase in the share of kids born outside of marriage. Something happens amidst the Great Recession that shifts all that. It's also partly driven, we see, by the
But at a very high level.
Correct, but it's stopped. It's stuck at 40%. It hasn't increased since then. And I think partly it's about somewhat of a cultural shift since the recession. People are a little bit more, I think, careful and cautious about having kids. I think it's also the changing ethnic composition. We have more Asian immigrants now at the sort of childbearing age, and they have much lower rates of non-marital childbearing than other Americans do. But nevertheless, the point is these things can change. And then on the divorce front, we have seen actually since the height of the divorce revolution in the 70s and 80s, that sort of the rate of divorce, particularly for college-educated Americans, actually has come down. There's actually a piece a few years ago in the New York Times talking about mothers in Park Slope and in Seattle, not exactly bastions of conservatism, talking about how, in their social circles, divorce had kind of become passé. And I think that's happened in part because there's been a kind of recognition, and this is from work that actually Brookings published this spring by Melissa Kearney and her colleague, there's been a kind of an explicit or an implicit recognition on the part of college-educated Americans that their kids are going to be more likely to flourish if they can figure this marriage thing out. If they can kind of make it through the inevitable difficulties and disappointments and rough spots in the average marriage. And so there's been some social learning that's taken place, I think, among college-educated Americans about divorce. And the question is, with conversations like this one, can we extend that kind of understanding of the importance of family stability and marriage for kids across the social spectrum?
I want to go to the question that Ian raised about the difficulty of different elements of our society being able to talk about these issues in an explicit way. And so, sometimes when we talk about, you in your recommendation, you say we should have a public messaging campaign. That's often done by government. And I know a little bit about that, and we'll come to that later. But the question is, what about churches? What about, Ian's raised the issue of schools and other groups. Where hasn't civil society also let us down on being clear about the potential consequences of making the decision about having a child before having a consistent and committed partner? Haven't they also not been as strong in sending that message? And how can we get those institutions to be more clear?
I actually just wrote an essay that's entitled, If Not Us, Who Will Help Make Human Beings Human? And if not now, a new generation of fragile families looms. And we basically makes the point that with the institutions through which young people normally did learn about family formation, whether that be the family itself, religious institutions, there's increased lack of trust with political leadership and political leaders. Those institutions themselves have become frayed, and which is why I actually believe public education as perhaps the only remaining social institution that actually engages kids almost every single day, we have the greatest responsibility and opportunity to actually teach kids about this kind of information, because we can't necessarily rely on other institutions. I would love for there to be a renewal of faith, public institutions, celebrities. I mean, I used to work at MTV running campaigns like this, but a wide range of voices, credible voices on this issue.
I do think that, given the fraying of social cohesion and the loss of that kind of middle layer of churches, which is work that Charles Murray here at AEI and Robert Putnam at Harvard has done, there's this question of kind of meeting people where they are, right? In the absence of those institutions, what works? And I think that there's a lot that works, and I think it's probably worth noting how much even very low-income families and individuals kind of socially agree with the success sequence, right? Like want to be married, want to go to college, want to send their kids to good public schools, all of that. But Melissa Kearney, whose work has come up a few times, had this great paper about how the show Teen Mom seems to have helped reduce rates of childbearing among teenagers, just as kind of, again, like meeting people where they are, sort of showing and expressing how hard it can be if you're not taking these steps. But I think it's this question, right? Like if you don't have those churches, if you don't have community organizations, if you don't have labor unions that are playing this role in civic life, I don't think that anybody has good answers for that.
Let me make an interesting point here. I work with the Annie Casey Foundation, a definitely, progressive institution. And when I first went there after 2001, they were focused somewhat on marriage, which distinguished them quite a bit. And they spent a fair amount of money on various marriage activities. And one of the things they did that was so interesting is that they invited prominent black ministers from all over the country to 2 different meetings. I would say it was a total of at least 25, maybe 30, and these were really prominent, had big churches and so forth, almost every one of them inner city. And and was specifically to discuss marriage, and I was amazed to find out that every single one of them thought it was a hugely important issue. They wished they could do something about it, and now my main point is they found it very difficult to do it because almost their entire constituency is female. And males don't go to church very often in the black community. It's mostly females. And many of them, a majority of them, even the ones that go to church every week, are single mothers So we come back to hectoring here. It's very difficult for the black church to play a role that I think it would be extremely valuable if they could do more on this issue, but they have some internal problems that at least are a barrier.
So talk about internal problems among groups. Brad, I'm going to address this question to you. This concerns conservatives. We're talking about sending a message about making better choices as individuals, but we also acknowledge, Brad, that not everybody makes those better choices, and they have kids. And I think you're not saying this is the only thing we need to do to help low-income, struggling kids in single-parent families, is to tell them, well, you've made a mistake, right? I mean, there are other interventions that you can do without undermining the argument that better choices also play a role.
Yeah, that's right. I think a number of the policy things that we've talked about both in this report and previous reports are indicative of things that could be helpful across the spectrum for families of all stripes and sizes, so to speak. So marriage is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. That's an important caveat to these kinds of discussions, and we have to recognize that there are a variety of both public policies and civic initiatives and other kinds of messaging issues around things like education that matter across the board. But I do also want to obviously stress this idea that, for many Americans, having the benefit of being raised by stable married parents does tend to give kids a leg up in life. And we can't, I think we're hesitant to mention that in public. We're hesitant to mention that in schools. We're hesitant to mention that on MTV. And so that sort of inability to talk about some plain truths about American family life, I think, is not a service to the broader public.
One technical question, Brad. On the income brackets, where were the cutoffs? I mean, do you remember what the cutoffs were between middle and upper?
We took the millennials by thirds. Wendy could answer that question perhaps better than I could.
Okay.
Yeah.
We divided them by a third and a third and a third, but we also adjust for family size. So the actual number does not mean much because it's like per capita.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're going to open up to questions from the audience now, and before we go into our second panel, so let's see if we've got any questions. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Roberta Stanley. I'm with the Clearinghouse on Women's.
You might want to wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I'm with the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues and a longtime administrator in the Michigan Department of Ed. One thing you haven't addressed, which would probably be helpful in every state in this nation, is we really should have sex education in the schools, because a lot of parents are either uncomfortable or don't do a very good job of it. And, we educate our children on so many fronts. This is a very critical aspect, to talk about anatomy, to talk about all sorts of issues of respect and dignity in that structure. If you would address that, please.
Okay. Maybe we'll start with you, Ian, since you're the educator.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that there should be more open and honest conversation about relationships, sex education. I think one of the dangers, though, of this thing called the success sequence is that somehow when people hear it, they go straight to marriage. They go straight to this particular element, and that's actually not what the data says. The data says education, work, marriage, then children, in that order. And I think there are reasons why each one of those are important in that sequence, because work, for example, full-time work, there's a certain dignity and discipline that comes from that probably allows you to earn more income, which allows you to probably have more of a future orientation, makes you more marriageable. Like there are things that all of those things matter, so that by the time you're now encountering decisions about marriage and childbirth, you just have a much greater sense of what the both rewards and consequences would be of that decision. So in schools, I actually don't know if I would teach the success sequence within a sex ed context. It's more almost economics or life knowledge, because I think if you're only focusing on that particular component, it's very easy to get into prickly moral conversations, and you lose sight of what the overall data is telling you.
This can descend into a big argument very quickly. Distinguishing between sex ed and programs that have an explicit goal of reducing, preventing teen pregnancy. But many schools do have these programs, and many of these programs have been rated by by the HHS and a very careful study with Mathematica to have produced in high-quality studies, actually reducing teen pregnancy, reducing sexual activity, and so forth. So I strongly agree that we should have these programs, but it wouldn't be just sex education. I think there ought to be a message about it. It's a bad idea to have sex.
I just want to add, my alma mater is in very serious trouble over the physician they hired for the gymnastics team. And these young women in this team, in their early teenage years, 11, 12, 13 years old, were touched and manipulated inappropriately by this pediatric doctor. They didn't realize till they were 19, 20, 21, 22 that it was inappropriate because they didn't know any better.
Right. Okay.
And, you know, like I said,
Thank you.
parents don't want to address this.
Yeah.
Parents don't. We need to have an education base.
Right.
I would just add also that, with the Commissioner of Education in New York State is pretty robust curriculum in health that covers sex education and contraception. We together sent out a request that they add to the curriculum at least a discussion of the important role fathers play in children's lives and some data about the consequences or correlations related to having children inside marriage. It seemed to me and others in New York that to have a very robust health education curriculum that covered these very sensitive issues and didn't mention marriage and life prospects seemed a little odd. Why not just, at least include it, a little of it? So, and we made some progress, but it was a hard uphill battle because people are very chary about talking about people's choices. But in poverty fighting, there are programmatic ways to help people, and there are also ways that have to do with people's choices, and we ought to talk about both. One more question, and then I think we'll go to the next panel. Yes, ma'am, in the green in the back. Yes.
Hi, I am Sulamis Daim. I am from Brazil, international education, and these are my students from Brazilian University. I very much understand the sequence, the millennial success sequence, and I think the evidence is very strong. My question addresses to public policy. What can you do? I mean, I'm interested in the rest, those who can't join the success sequence. For me, it's not a question of will. Many of them would like to, but how in college, how to go to college, how to behave after college. You don't have the networks. You probably are from a single parent home. You don't speak foreign languages. You haven't read books. So is there something you can do in terms of policy so that many more people could join the success sequence in the United States?
Brad, do you want to go, or Ron, or either one of you? Any of you?
So I would say a couple of things, I guess. One is that I think other countries, like Germany, for instance, does a better job of serving the educational and vocational welfare of its young adults who are not on that more elite college track than does the United States. And so, and I have, I've got kids who are on a variety of different tracks, and the kids who are not on the more college track in my own family are, they're struggling in school. They don't really see anything in school that speaks to their interest or experience. And so at a very local level, I sort of see this playing out where the sort of focus is on getting kids into college and through college, and not speaking to the kids who don't have that academic interest or orientation. So I think we could do a lot better job on sort of the local, the state, and the federal levels, and thinking more seriously about how do we speak to kids at a young age, but also as they move into adulthood, and address their educational needs in ways that will provide them with access to decent paying jobs, whether it's in the trades or manufacturing or the service sector. So I think on the education front, we could do a lot more to sort of see success also not just through the lens of college, but through other professions that provide decent paths into the middle class and often higher, depending upon the profession. I think also one thing that we haven't talked about today, it's been come up in previous discussions around these issues, is we also have to be careful in the United States, particularly as a sort of a means-tested approach to social policy, not to penalize marriage or to kind of send off the message to younger adults who are living together, having a child for the first time together, that sort of the price of getting access to Medicaid, the price of getting access to food stamps, or a Pell Grant is not putting a ring on your finger. So that's also, I think, that's something we should be thinking about from the public policy perspective.
I don't think we should, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that, on the left, places like the Aspen Institute, there's momentum growing around things called two-generation solutions. So those are initiatives, for example, parent-child home visiting programs that are by design trying to support typically a single mother and a baby. So for our schools, for example, we're considering partnering with a parent-child home program where the younger siblings of our current scholars would actually get a home visit twice a week by an early learning specialist for 46 weeks over 2 years, all around helping that young mother typically build a language-rich environment at home. So by the time that 2 years is over and they enter our pre-K, the normal vocabulary deficits we see, the school readiness or unreadiness that we typically see, hopefully has been mitigated by us partnering with organizations like that. So two-generation solutions seem to be something that's growing in popularity. It would be a great thing if most people also saw teaching the success sequence in schools as a two-generation solution in the same way. But in this case, the two generations are the young person who's currently in school and their future child, because they're developing a new expectation for the choices that they will make in their life.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's not always a lot of low-hanging fruit in public policy, but here I do think that there is. The United States tolerates an enormous amount of child poverty that could be mitigated through things like the Rubio-Lee proposal to increase the size of the child tax credit. There's a lot of things that we could do to bring that number down. It's rarely a focus in public policy, but I do think it's a place where there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement that kids in America don't have to grow up in poverty, especially given how much wealth there is in this country. And I think it was a point that Ron made that a lot of our anti-poverty programs just don't work that well. Again, and like Brad pointed out, reducing or eliminating the marriage penalty in the tax code, right? Again, there's bipartisan agreement. Nobody supports the marriage penalty in the tax code, to my knowledge, right? But there are sort of simple, straightforward things that we could do that would ameliorate the effects here outside of these kind of broader architectures to help people, to give people the ability to make better choices. Again, since I do think that there is a lot of cultural emphasis and agreement on the success sequence and a desire for people to, again, be married, to be part of the workforce, to be educated.
Ron, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add one thing. We should emphasize we do a lot. We have many programs that are addressed especially to work and education. And I would make a sharp distinction here between research studies of these issues and our public policy that affects, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. We've done much better in the research. So we have learned a lot of things that are effective. And if we did them on a broader scale, we would be more effective. We would have more kids that would have good, young people that would have good jobs. We could be more successful in the schools. Annie mentioned preschool. We don't do nearly as much. So we're doing things. I think we're doing better. We're learning a lot. If we would focus our money on things that are more successful and have a strategy of developing successful programs and then implementing them across the country, we would do a lot better and give kids in the low-income groups a better chance to follow the success sequence and be successful.
So I realized that in calling on the questioners, I had not called on a millennial. So I feel to close this panel out, I'm going to call on a millennial. You had a question, is that right? And I'm assuming you're a millennial. Maybe I'm making a bad assumption, and if I am, I apologize.
No, thank you. I'm Meridian Paul. I'm an intern at the Heritage Foundation. A couple of you have mentioned the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I was wondering if you see opportunities there to eliminate penalties on marriage, because I think that there are implicit penalties in marriage in the EITC, and then also to promote work better, because currently we see there's all these work requirements and stuff, but they're not necessarily super well enforced and not necessarily working. So where in the tax code, in welfare, do you see places where we could actually make effective reforms to not just have these be ideas, but see the actual changes?
So Brad, you mentioned the ITC, so why don't you hit that one?
Yeah, in terms of the EITC, it's complicated in the sense that in some configurations there's a kind of a marriage bonus for EITC. In some situations there's a marriage penalty. So it kind of depends upon who's earning what, and how much. But I think that sort of speaks to the way in which the EITC is connected to one's household structure. And I think one way to kind of move forward is to sort of detach some of these programs from from household structure, and so to kind of make kind of a wage subsidy that would be just that would be sort of designed just to subsidize work itself, and then to so it wouldn't depend upon your household size or configuration, and there of course there would therefore be no marriage penalty attached to an EITC like that or wage subsidy like that, and then to turn, as Annie mentioned, to the child tax credit. As a way to expand support for families across the board, including lower-income families. So that would be one way to kind of simplify and to eliminate any marriage penalties attendant to those two particular programs.
Okay, with that, I'm going to stop, and then we're going to assemble our next panel, and I hope you all will remain for another great discussion. So thank you all, to all of you. You were all wonderful. All right, you were great. I'm staying here. I think we'll get started now. Is everybody ready? Okay. So, welcome back. In these policy discussions that I've been in these for some time, from when I was a commissioner of social services in New York City, and often we have very high level and very academic discussions and charts, and we talk about kids, and we talk about young people, and we talk about communities, but we don't always involve them or include them in the discussion to find out how what we're saying sounds to them. And Brad and Ian felt strongly that we ought to try that and make this discussion more whole and more full. And as a result, they have recruited some really wonderful people to join us here at AEI and to contribute to the discussion. And I'm just very glad that you guys are here. I'm going to introduce you, but I also need to say it's a particularly happy day for me because I'm a New Yorker and I grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm living now in this city here, Washington. And I really miss New York, and having the three of you, and Ian as well, you're also in New York, here on this panel with me. I finally got my way, an all New York panel. So I'm very glad that you're here. So starting directly next to me is Daisha Rivas, who has just graduated the 8th grade at Girls Prep Bronx Middle School, and she's going to Beacon, which is a very, very well-respected high school in New York City. And we've just been talking, and Beacon has one of the best soccer programs, and Daisha plays soccer, so that's good for Beacon, and hopefully good for Daisha as well. So welcome, Daisha. And then also with us is Kessie Wilson, who is an alumna of Girls Prep in the 8th grade, and then has spent the last 4 years at Phillips Exeter Academy. And Kessie and I have a lot in common. We're both from Brooklyn. She went to Exeter. I went to Andover. That's a rivalry for those of you who don't know. And somebody told me recently that Exeter won all the big games this year, so that was too bad for my team. And now you're on your way to Yale next year, and good luck with that. And then we also have Michael Farkash on the far right, who is the principal of Girls Prep Bronx Middle School. After earning a political science degree from Arizona State University, he taught English at a public high school in Phoenix as part of Teach for America, before returning to the East Coast to teach at 2 New York City public charter schools and then Girls Prep. So a lot of experience in educating young men and women. So we're very glad to have you with us. So what I want to do is start out by saying, we've heard about the success sequence, and I'm going to turn to you two first, and you go in any order you want to go. How do you guys talk to each other about these kinds of choices? What do you say, and how do these choices sound to you in the way you discuss these issues with your friends? Who wants to go first? Daisha, you want to go first? Kessie goes first.
I'll do it. So first, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. I think the short answer to that question is that it's not often discussed. So it's not at all, actually. And I'm 16. Most of my friends are 17 and 18. And it's not the most relevant thing, especially the marriage aspect of the success sequence. The jobs and graduating from college are probably, and I know graduating college is not one of the three, but those two things are more relevant to someone going into college than marrying and having children. And so it just seems, especially another point is that that Mr. Rowe brought up earlier, that schools have a really good vehicle into mentioning those things very directly, whereas if I'm an administrator at a school and I want to push marriage and having children in that order, it's a really hard thing to do, especially, and this is something that I was talking with Mr. Rowe about, especially because a lot of the families that, at least not at Exeter perhaps, but a lot of the families that benefit from the work that public prep does do not follow that structure. And so to say that and then have a child go home and say, my my family structure is wrong is like, it's a big deal. And so it's not as easy to talk about those things. So that's kind of the long answer.
Taisha, how about you? Is there, I mean, these are big topics, but, you know, you guys are covering some big issues. Would you, and does peer pressure or getting a high school degree, graduating 8th grade, do you encourage each other?
Yeah, like we encourage each other to like go to high school, go to college, and like that's like one of like the rule, like that's what they like our teachers and principal encourage us to do. But as Cassie said, like marriage is not something that we really talk about. Like it's kind of like you kind of like have to internalize like what you're thinking because like it's not talked about every day. Like how like all the students when they realized that they were going to their high schools, it was like so exciting. But like marriage was never like talked. Like we're so young, and I think that we're not expecting it to come like marriage to come by so fast. But then once like we get to college, we're gonna start realizing that like life keeps going. So I think that like.
So, Daisha, I don't want to press you on this, but down there is your principal, right? He's your principal? He was your principal? Okay. So, what's the most prominent message you have in your head that Mr. Farkash gave you?
I think the like message that like he tries to encourage to all students is like to try your best no matter what. Like go to college, go to high school, and like do what you need to do to get like a good like education, because that's what like it doesn't matter what our like race is or gender, like as long as you have an education, I think you're gonna get like far in life.
Okay, so work hard in school, do your homework.
Do your homework.
Good for you, Mr. Farkash. So let me bring you in now. What are you hearing in the halls? What are you hearing kids talking to each other about, and what do you say on these issues?
Sure. So, like Cassie said, it isn't something that I hear a lot of. It's what kids aren't generally talking about marriage. I mean, they'd be much more likely to talk about the particular person they find attractive, or actually, our 8th graders just came to DC last week for the 8th grade trip. We had 2 nights and 3 days, and we ran into an Instagram star, or a Musical.ly star, Mark Thomas. I didn't know who he was, and I was grateful that at least half of our girls didn't. But that's the kind of thing that if we're talking about socially or those kinds of things that we would be talking about. I think one of the things to build on what Cassie was talking about earlier is that there's this idea of shame. And this idea that when you are not like everyone else is, or you don't have the structure that we are saying is normative, or is positive, or what is going to result in the best outcomes, then you go home and you think, why is my family not like this? Or somehow my family is deficient. And as an adolescent, you think your family is deficient anyway. That's just a part of where you are at that place in your life. And so it becomes a challenge when you want to work in partnership with families, and you trust families, and you love families, and you appreciate their role in their daughter's education, to at the same time say, like, but really your family should be like this, and your daughter would be having better outcomes if there were a 2-parent family. And so I think that the challenge that Wendy and Brad articulated around making it clear that, in fact, having a 2-parent family generally does result in having stronger outcomes for kids does not in any way mean that you and your family cannot be successful, right, or that we look down on or see your family in a negative light as a result.
But now, Michael, just to press you also a little bit on that, in the curriculum in school, in social studies or history, you talk about public policy, you talk about Dr. King, for instance, or the history of the United States. Is there in that curriculum, or poverty or low-income communities, is there a feint or some kind of recognition of the topics that Daniel Patrick Moynihan brought up with his report about the role that family plays in poverty? Is that a possibility?
Yes, I mean, so there are definite possibilities. So for instance, in 7th grade, we have a unit about choices that we make regarding food. And so we talk about Michael Pollan and other arguments around the way that we should farm, the way that we should, what foods we should buy, to help our students be critical consumers. And we look at multiple perspectives, and it's consistent with the Common Core state standards. So we're asking students to delineate the argument, find which arguments have the most textual evidence, which are the most credible sources, those kinds of academic skills that students need to develop regardless of the issue that they're analyzing. But then even within that unit, so then our girls are very excited about their food choices, and then you go to the bodega next to the school, and there is literally nothing that one might consider healthy. There is not a diet soda. There is not fruit and bananas. There are not, I don't know, like vegan flaxseed chips. Like there aren't those kinds of options. And then you actually look at the maps that are provided, and we live in a food desert, actually, where our school is right now. The Lower East Side Middle School, that was not the case, but in the South Bronx it is. And so then we're saying, here is the reality, and now you have these choices that you're going to be able to make when you're independent in 5 years, when you're independent in 7 years. So when Ian talks about the two-generation solution, I think that's a really salient point, that it may not be something that is immediately acted on.
But the concept of food deserts and diet and what's available in grocery stores and communities, those are pretty sophisticated public policy issues. And if you're getting into that level of depth, it's conceivable that in a discussion of, the difficulties faced by low-income families, that the role of fathers in children's life could come up as well. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so we could do similar work that says, let's look at 4 different texts with various perspectives. Or we could put a video of the panel that we just saw, and we could analyze the arguments that Annie made versus the ones that Ron made. Yeah. And we could ask where their evidence was and what sources they were citing, those kinds of things, as a part of that debate.
And I would also add, something that we're thinking about, because we're so fearful of what will happen if a child goes home and starts spraying these messages within their own family, is actually talk to families first, right? To actually survey and have focus groups with our parents to ask them, generally, what are your aspirations for your son or daughter? What would you think if we started to talk to them about data such as this? It's almost as if giving a preview to parents, to the very people that you think are so fearful that potentially hearing this information. My sense is we're going to hear from most of our parents that this is exactly what they would like us to do. That our parents are choosing our schools not only because hopefully they'll go to great schools like Yale or Beacon, they'll get a great education in science and literacy and math, but also will educate their kids about the choices that will likely lead to life success, even if those were not the same choices they made.
Cassie, I want to ask you, you heard that panel before. What struck you about what you heard from the various panelists that you would want to comment on, or you wish you could have asked?
Something that I wish I probably could have asked, but I didn't, was in response to, early on, I'm blanking on his name right now, but someone mentioned that this success sequence, is not a causal sequence, and it was juxtaposed with the kind of, I want to say crusade, but that's not really the right term, but with the push against teen pregnancy, in the sense that was very direct and it worked because that was more causal, and that could be presented in a very black and white manner. But as for something that's not causal, but it's also not random, so there is a correlation. One of my questions was just, how do you present something like that that's not necessarily black and white to an audience that is most receptive of something incredibly black and white? The way that we present things nowadays is very yes or no, and gray areas tend to not be looked into by several people, by large groups of people. And so with that in mind, how do you present something that's not causal, that's not black and white, in a way that still I guess frames it as relevant or frames it as important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really important point because sometimes I actually don't like to refer to the success sequence as the success sequence because someone might walk away with their success. There's guaranteed success at the end of this, and there isn't necessarily. I normally try to talk about it as an opportunity pathway because there is no guarantee. We have many examples within our own schools of children of single parents who are doing incredibly well, who moms and dads or grandmothers or whatever the configuration, they've created an incredible environment for their child, and kids succeed despite the challenges. And there are other examples, although less so, but there are other examples of stable two-parent households where outcomes for children are not always successful. So there isn't a guarantee. So there is nuance. And I think it is always important to acknowledge that it isn't always black and white. That said, the data is pretty overwhelming, even if it's not causal, that when you do these things, outcomes are better for kids. And not only in education, but in health, crime, all sorts of outcomes. And again, that's why I think it's incumbent that we as schools figure out ways to be able to communicate to kids and families in such a way that we're not shaming, that we're actually hopefully empowering young people in such a way that they can make the decisions for themselves and ultimately for their children as well.
Aisha, did you have any comment on the previous panel that you have sort of kept inside, you want to get out before I go to the next question? I'm not rushing you.
No.
Okay. So this is the next thing we're going to do here is a little bit of a setup that Brad has put me into. When I was the commissioner in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, we did a public messaging campaign on these issues, and we did posters in bus stops and subways, and I thought I'd show one or two of those and see how you guys react to them. And of course, the setup part is that you're allowed to say that's just the silliest, stupidest thing I've ever seen, and I can take it. Don't worry, it happens to me all the time. So let's see this first one. So this is, and you guys can look at it there if it's easier for you. So this was taken directly from Dr. Haskins and Belle Sawhill's work, which at that point had this statistic. If you finish high school, get a job, and get married before having children, you have a 98% chance of not being in poverty. Think being a teen parent won't cost you, ? And then there are photographs of children. And the idea was to convey that these decisions and questions are about your kids or about children. This is about kids and their prospects for their futures. How do you guys react to that? Kessie, you can go first.
So I've actually seen these ads before. I've seen like a lot of them. I think, so my initial response to them was like no response, just because when I first saw them, I was like,
Did you see them when they were in the buses? Or
Yes.
You saw them in the...
Yeah. That being said, I am one of like 3 people I know that reads advertisements on the bus and train. So I like words and I like to read. So I think that there's something to be said there. But my first response to this, now that I'm like this age and I'm going to college, is that it's blunt and to the point, which is a good thing. But one of the first, and it was brought up in the previous panel as well, and it's not something that you can address in an advert, I'm like almost positive, but like finishing high school, getting a job, and getting married, I think, are results of like, what household you're brought up in, but also just like what environment you're brought up in. And so a lot of this is about setting up an environment structure, partly through schools, partly through other means that will encourage kids to go this route, which I think will happen given the right environment, like environmental pressure, if you want to phrase it that way. Yeah. So like this strikes me as almost not enough in the sense that there's so many moving parts. There's policy, there's schools, there's churches, there's like so many other things. But I do think that it got the message across and started conversation, if that makes sense, because they are blunt to the point in a way that is usually not the case.
Aisha, you want to make a comment?
It's very blunt. But
Well,
like,
wait till you see the next one.
but like what Cassie said, like it's very straightforward to start a conversation, and like a lot of times, like there's many schools where, like not one of mine because mine is fabulous, but like there's a lot of schools where like students may not have the chance to like know what they're doing in their life, and they don't have guidance. So it's like these ads are like bringing up questions where it's like they're starting to like build a pathway to like where they're going.
Well, it's funny, when we talked about these, we did group sessions with young kids, and in one of them, I was with some young people in a public school in New York City, and I said, what is something that one of your friends might do, say at Exeter or at Beacon next year, that you would be willing to say to them, that's not a good idea? You shouldn't do that. Would, staying up all night and studying, would that be something you'd say? That's too hard on you. Or going AWOL at boarding school and leaving the campus. You might say, maybe you better not do that, right? So there are some things where you might encourage your friend to think carefully about their choice. Drugs, for instance. Would you discourage a classmate from taking drugs?
Yes, obviously.
All right. Good. Okay. Good. All right.
But
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things, if I can be honest, that I think are problematic about this for me from a school perspective. So I think one is this normative idea of like the getting married and having children is a necessity. So this is kind of this normative idea that this is what the expectation is, when in fact the research that we saw today shows that people who are not married are the most economically successful, right, at where they are right now. Don't have kids. Don't have kids, right? And so this is not something that's like a necessity in a way that this makes it seem that it's framing the debate in a way that is required. The second thing there, and I very much want to get married, so I hope my partner is watching this, and have children. But the second thing about this that I'm not sure how effective it would be for adolescents is think being a teen parent won't cost you, scaring children, or trying to talk to adolescents as though this is something that like in the same way, if you don't do this, I'm gonna do this. Like the threatening is not an effective way of messaging for adolescents. Like actually what they need to see is like what the positive outcomes, you have to feed the narcissism that is natural there and say like, here's what's going to be good for you. And so I like the 98% chance of not being in poverty, but I think what's more effective is like, what is the positive messaging or what are the images of success as a result of following the sequence?
It is interesting. So I was at MTV when we first launched the television show 16 and Pregnant. And that, because there were obviously, you could have a couple of choices, right? You could have PSAs which talked about the negative consequences of being a 16 and pregnant, or actually have a show that depicted the lives of kids that you could identify with and literally just to see the challenges that they faced, right? And see the choices that they made and the consequences. And there was a period of time where the data showed that it contributed, we think, to the reduction in the teen pregnancy rate. After a while, when Teen Mom and other shows started glamorizing, then I think some of those positive effects rebounded, or went down. So it is always a delicate balance in terms of pushing the consequences of a certain action for desired social behavior versus trying to present it from the perspective of young people who are engaged in that behavior, where others can just see it for themselves without being told necessarily what to do. That hopefully that those kinds of interactions lead to a person making decisions for themselves.
When we did this, we did some focus groups, and the bluntness thing came out. Everybody agreed, and when you do an advertisement focus group, you go into a room with young people, and before you show them it, you say, have you seen ads that have some message about teen pregnancy and the consequences? And most people, when they're asked a question about advertisements, just like you said, Kessie, they haven't seen them, they don't pay any attention to them. There's thousands of things that come across you. In this one, it was off the charts. They all said, "Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I remember that." And that's why the bluntness is part of the deal. So here, okay, now here's another one. We'll do one more. So this is a little blunter. Honestly, Mom, chances are he won't stay with you. What happens to me? Are you ready to raise a child by yourself? 90% of teen parents don't marry each other. Again, it's about teen pregnancy. And again, we are clearly using a worried child's face to convey a message. So, as again, I said this was a setup. Anybody want to comment on this one? Yeah, go ahead.
Um,
It's okay.
much more blunt.
Much more fun.
But like, it's like, as Mr. Farkash said, it like instills like fear into this like young teens as to like children. Like, oh my God, like children. So it's like, yeah, it's. I mean, I think it's a good ad, but there's like something wrong with it, but I don't know what it is yet.
I agree. I think this one strikes me as more problematic, both in the way that Mr. Farkash outlined and in a way that I'm not sure of yet. Particularly the chances are he won't stay with you, which I'm sure is like a statistic, like underneath that phrase, but like there seems to be, like now that it's A, been outlined, and B, like it's in this advertisement, there's like a really strong sense of like, if you don't do this, like you'll be doomed for life, which is like probably effective. Like you wouldn't jump into a volcano because you'll be doomed for life. Like that makes a lot of sense. But
Well, jumping into a volcano and having a child are not.
they're different. I understand. But
And it is worth saying very clearly 100 times. Many children raised in single-parent families do very, very well. In fact, most do pretty well. It's just compared, and the chances are a little harder, and it's more difficult. And I think that, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's very important to remind everyone of that. Go ahead.
well, I think I'm interested in hearing like, or maybe from like you as well, but also from the both of you, what a positive advertisement might look like or sound like.
Yeah, it is, again, this is all interesting. So, and again, we spent a lot of time on this at MTV and at Gates as well, and just how do you create more aspirational messages, right? So if you're a guy reading this, if you're a young man and you see language like chances are he won't stay with you, that's clearly setting pretty low expectations for what your behavior is, right? And so it actually makes it easier for people to live up to extremely low expectations. And so how do you flip this in such a way that a young man wants to see what the positive benefit, the fact that they could be in a loving relationship, that they could be a responsible person, that they wouldn't be a statistic, we tried to convince folks like Jay-Z, who widely respected in certain communities, to actually talk about the fact that he's married, has children, follow the success sequence. But generally, a lot of folks don't actually want to almost admit. Somehow it makes them less authentic. Who knows? But it's usually trying to convince folks who are doing the behavior that you want and living it out and reaping the benefits. Those are the kinds of those are the kinds of approaches I think typically work when we're evidencing the benefits of the aspiration versus trying to create fear out of the negative consequences.
I think when I see this, as with most things, if students are doing things that are contrary to what I think is in their best interest, I'm wondering what need is being met by the activity. I'm wondering what it is either that I have failed to provide or we have failed to provide, or what is it that is the human need that they're authentically expressing in a way that might be less than positive. And so I'm thinking here, it's like, what I'm wondering is why are children getting pregnant? Why are teenagers getting pregnant? And so this to me communicates maybe like that we think that we can make them afraid of what the consequences of that will be. And that's part of it, right? Like we make decisions sometimes based on our fear of the consequences. But I think that there must be something else going on there that is causing them to get pregnant in the first place. So for instance, I can't remember the exact statistic, but a ridiculous number of pregnancies occur between the hours of 4:30 and 6:30 because that's the time between when school lets out and when families are done with work. And so, for instance, I'm thinking, well, we should have an after-school program that's from 4:30 to 6:30, which in fact we do. And so I would similarly look for, from the school standpoint, look for solutions that do address whatever that need is. And very often I think that need is connectedness and is love and is a feeling that there's a caring adult who is involved in your life and cares about you, not just this year, but for years beyond, and who's committed to you in your journey.
The two educators at the end, and then we can have you guys pipe in on this as well from your perspective. You raised the issue of consequences or negative sanctions that can happen in a structured environment. And leaving the issue of teen pregnancy and non-marital births out, but just in school homework, showing up, being on time, not cutting classes. You do run a charter school program that has some structure, is that right? And how do you meet, and you do have to sometimes, I don't know, I'm afraid of Mr. Farkas a little bit. Have you ever, wagged your finger at all? I mean, do you ever, when do you say, now look, I need you to comply? And Kessie, when have you heard a message like that from Exeter or anywhere you've been where it's been effective?
Kessie, do you want to talk about what we talked about last night at dinner?
What did we talk about?
About related to telling someone to shut up and what ensued?
So, am I telling the story? Okay, so long story short, so Mr. Farkas was my 7th and 8th grade English teacher. I think this incident occurred in the 7th grade. A girl said shut up to me, and that's not okay, but I said shut up to her, which is also not okay. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm the only one who received a punishment, which was that instead of, first it was just detention, but instead I walked Mr. Farkas to his house, and then we stood outside for a various amount of time. I don't know, I say that it was over an hour, he does not, but talking about the situation and situations like it in which I was having a hard time dealing with having made the wrong choice. So instead of just sending me to detention, he actually walked me through, took time to sit down with me and to, it was a don't do that, but it wasn't a don't do that, go away, you're a bad kid. It was you made a choice, you need to deal with it. Don't make this choice in the future if it makes you feel bad, blah, 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 blah.
So yes, there absolutely, of course, is a role for consequences. And when students make really poor choices inconsistent with our core values and our school norms, we do have consequences for that. But, as I think we've seen with the criminal justice system, just giving a stiffer penalty for people making poor choices is not going to result in them then making better choices. There has to be something rehabilitative. There has to be something that repairs the harm to the community. And so if that looks like us having a real conversation about why we don't tell people to shut up, which is just a really small example for a very high-performing student who made very few poor choices against our core values and many very good choices, that they have to work in tandem.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very helpful. I'm sorry that we had to bring up that bad time. Okay, so let's open it up for questions from the audience now, and let's see if we can get any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Gina Russos. I'm with the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and I'm noticing that these ads and this general conversation about teen pregnancy has focused on women and their role in having a teen pregnancy. But I think it's important to note that men have a role in a pregnancy occurring. And I think in general, a lot more blame and responsibility is placed on girls and women to be the one to take care of birth control and to try to convince the boyfriend that they don't want to have a kid. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what kinds of things you might talk to young boys and men about, and what approaches you might take to show them what role they have in teen pregnancy.
Ian, you want to take that?
So first of all, I 100% agree, especially on the eve of Father's Day this weekend. There's a huge amount of research that talks about the impact of father-absent homes, and you're absolutely right that most of the dialogue typically does seem to rest around girls and women making these decisions, but there's no question guys play a huge role. We only have representatives here from our girls' prep schools, but know that these same topics are going to be discussed in our boys' prep schools. Right now our boys' school is from kindergarten through 4th grade, and as our boys get older, these will be central topics that are extremely, extremely relevant. So 100% agree.
I would just say that you're right in that what we're showing here, partly due to the nature of this discussion, is focused in more on young women than on boys. But there is a lot of public messaging campaigns about fatherhood and the role of men in children's lives. In fact, there may even be more than this kind of message. Wade Horn, who's the former ACF commissioner, has funded a number of programs. I did fatherhood promotion programs and promoting positive fatherhood roles. And then the child support program had for a long time a lot of states that were sending curriculum advice to young high school programs where they described the potential costs and how the child support enforcement system worked to at least try to ensure that every parent who is absent is at least providing some financial support in the household. And they did it in ways in which they showed the potential cost of even a very low child support order on someone's income for a long period of time. And there was a mild threat that involved in that. So those things have happened. And Sarah McClanahan, who we talked before, is a Princeton sociologist who is very strong on these issues, had a finding that states with strong child support enforcement programs and publicized the strength of their enforcing the requirement that absent parents provide financial support had lower non-marital birth rates. So there is that in there. We just didn't bring it to this discussion, but thank you very much for bringing that topic up. Yes, sir.
My name is Yaya Fanusi with US Africa 2017 Project Task Force. Sorry, I only came for the Q&A section of the first panel. So.
Well, you've missed a lot.
Okay.
Sorry. See, that was a consequence. I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
Talking about marriage, I think you need to figure out another way. In case I brought a hammer on that table and asked people here what it is for, nearly 98% of you all here would say to hit a nail, right? That's what you say if I bring a hammer.
Yeah, and we're with you on that.
But for somebody else, they might think, oh, that's a murder weapon. So you need to start looking at marriage not as a goal, but as another competitive resources for you to advance your personal, family, society goals. When you start looking at it that way, you'll know how to couch the ads and things.
That's a very good. Does
Thank
anyone want to comment on that? I have a comment on that. Cassie, do you have anything?
I do, but I'm still thinking about it, so you should go first.
Okay. Well, the way I take your comment, it reminds me of my oldest son, who is a lovely guy, and he did graduate from high school and college. We think he's a little, mildly scatterbrained, but he announced at 22 a year ago that he was going to marry the young woman that he was dating at that time in college, in the first summer after graduating from college. Very young to get married. And my wife and I thought to ourselves, this is going to be very good for him, because the bringing together of two people to live their life and to take on their challenges with two would shore up him, and he would help her. And you're right, it's not a hammer, it's a tool. It's a method to help you advance, and marriage is in that way very utilitarian, if that's the right word. So that's how I respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in schools, as Mr. Farkash said, it's not. It's very hard to be prescriptive, right? It's all about giving young people, in particular, information. But it is true that not all life choices have equal consequences, and the power, I think, of this data shows, because you can compare. There's the children after marriage path. There's the childless marriage path. There's the child with no marriage path, and there are different outcomes. And I think it's pretty reliable, that evidence. So it's not a hammer per se, but it is a range of choices, and the more that young people hopefully absorb what the rewards or consequences are of each, they will make their own decisions. That's personal agency. It's actually not trying to be a hammer. It's really just trying to ensure that you're making truly informed decisions.
I think about like I want to say, at least from like a child standpoint, I am a child. I've been so for 16 years. Like when the idea of marriage, my mom is not married. I find out later in life that it's because she does not want to marry. She doesn't really like favor that idea at all. But I know my father, like he's in my life. And so when the idea of marriage was first brought up to me, it wasn't, and it's also not only through my mom, but also through TV, like through my friends who would talk about like, oh, my parents are married, blah, blah, blah. It rarely is phrased in like I'm rarely getting the viewpoint at which it's presented as a tool, in the sense that I'm getting this example. Marriage is when two people love each other very much, and they love each other enough to put up with each other for 10 plus years. If something goes wrong, they divorce. Like that is, I think, what's more or less being perpetuated. It's rarely do I get like sitting right here, I have no idea what the benefits of marriage are from an economic standpoint. I can probably say one sentence on that and then nothing more, but I know that when people love each other very much, they get married. And so if we are to frame it as a tool, and I think that would do wonders for like convincing people that the success sequence is effective, and it's more than just like, oh, two things happen to be, kind of correlated, not really. In order to convince people, of the correlation of the data that is so like wonderfully presented, if we're going to change that framework, frankly, I don't know how you change that framework, like how you would sit down with a child and say like, marriage works economically and because you love this person, but like if you want more money or something, I don't know. I guess that's like a question. I have no idea what the answer is. So.
And I think what's hard about this, just taking the economic standpoint, is that marriage goes to like our fundamental idea of who man is. And so like I don't think that humans are utility maximizers. And so like for me, an economic argument about marriage like is insulting, right? Like I think it's a holy sacrament. And so for me, it's difficult. And to have this conversation in a school, I'm not going to say, you should get married because it's a holy sacrament. Like, we don't have necessarily the same religious beliefs. Like, and when we talk about, this was the whole argument about civil unions versus gay marriage, or same-sex marriage, right? We're talking about, it's not just the range of economic benefits that are available. It has to do with society's imprimatur and their belief in something that is bigger than just an economic relationship or a contract between two people. So I think, to me, it'd be really demeaning only to talk about it in those terms, but then what the challenge becomes is, how do you talk about it in a term that says that it has something deeper without imposing your own beliefs about the good?
And on top of that, with a society that's shifting away from viewing marriage as this, just, me and my friends, it's not very necessary, and it's more of a, if I cross that bridge, I cross it, and if I don't, I don't, which is, not a bad way to view it, but with a society that's shifting further and further away from viewing marriage as, such an important milestone in adulthood, how do you then, structure those conversations regardless, especially through a school setting, in a school setting? How do you convince children my age, children younger, directly or indirectly, that marriage is still an important thing, and it has obviously it has personal benefits, it has a range of benefits, personal, societal, economic. How do you structure those conversations if I'm already being driven all the way this way?
You're bringing up the issue of nutrition is another analogy you might, that marriage or the partnering with someone to take on life's challenges is like managing your diet so that you do the right things for your future health, not just economically, but emotionally and as a parent. So I get that economics alone shouldn't do it, and certainly we don't want to make it all based on some religious belief, because that's crossing into lines. But there is a benefit to that goes, maybe that analogy is not so bad. It's just a sort of a way of providing for your own health and well-being.
So in other words,
life is better. Life is harder to take on alone, and can sometimes be easier if you have a partner.
And maybe one way to look at this, and maybe this gets to Mr. Farkash's point of, the data shows that if you're unmarried and childless, you're also economically well off. Maybe the focus or the emphasis should be at the decision point of having a child. Right? Because it's not, obviously, I do think marriage is powerful, but it's when you cross into that decision where you're bringing a child into the world, responsibility changes. Because the consequences of your decisions don't only accrue to you, now you're talking about this human being. And so maybe there's an opportunity there, that there's a pivot off of the institution of marriage per se alone versus to how do you think about the decision to bring a child into the world? And what responsibilities do you have there?
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to thank our panelists and give them a chance to say a final word. So think about that a little bit. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Working. My name is Ted Bender. I am with Montgomery County Public Schools, but as a substitute teacher, my career life was a school psychologist in the District of Columbia Public Schools. So I've kind of been out there for a long time. I think one dimension that's missing that hasn't been directly addressed consistently in this whole country, let alone our discussion this morning, is human dignity. Human dignity. It's absent in our politics. It's absent in much discourse. It's out there. It's out there as a dimension of life, or as Ian pointed out, there's a human being involved. You're bringing a human being into the world, and there's much research and writing on the first 3 years of life and how indelible an effect the initial years of life have on our whole future life, including adulthood. Parenting. Shouldn't parenting be part of the public school or private school or charter school curriculum? Parenting. Okay. And that would, I think, raise the threshold of awareness of responsibility of bringing in a human being to life, whether one wants to undertake it, and if one does undertake it, how does one behave as a parent? Because we often have war stories of childhood, early childhood, brought as adults into therapy sessions.
Okay, so that's actually a good question about parenting, education, and where is it appropriate in schools, and I'd be interested in the reaction of our panelists on that. Daish?
Yeah, a lot of times, like during the school year, our teachers and our school setting is like our parents. We have tons of teachers that help us through our day. A lot of times we spend time at recess with our teachers, just talking and talking about schoolwork and how that affects us. So I think besides my actual parents, I think my teachers are one of my greatest parents. Mm-hmm. And they help me through stuff, and not just academics, but stuff that goes on in life, and they're guiding me, not as teachers, but as friends, to guide me as to where I want what I want to do in life after high school.
So they're setting a nurturing example.
Yes.
That you learn from, and how you will relate to younger people in the future in your life.
Yes.
I
think
Yes.
that another way an example is set, and like obviously I know that this happens at Girls Prep because I went there, but I also know my mother works at a different charter school, and they do that there as well. The emphasis on core values, I think, is like a very it's not incredibly straightforward in the sense that I'm directly telling you that doing these things will make you a better parent in the future, but chances are if you're a better person, you're a better parent. And so the emphasis on simple values that can be rewarded very directly. I don't know if you guys still do this, but the polos. You can win these polos for the 4 core values at Girls Prep, at least at all of them.
Polos, are you? They're talking about
Yeah,
shirts.
shirts. So
Okay.
it's part of the uniform, and on a certain day, basically you can get a polo, and there's one for scholarship, merit, sisterhood, and responsibility. They're different colors.
Scholarship, merit.
Sisterhood and responsibility.
Okay.
And they're different colors, and it's very fun. And you can wear them on different days, and so that. There's a very strong correlation between if I do this positive thing, I'm rewarded positively, and in the future, then I feel an inherent need to be sisterly to other people or to be responsible because I was rewarded for it in the past, and now I understand that it's a good thing. So I think that that's an indirect but equally as effective way, and there are many other ways I could go into that, at least through a school standpoint, I'm sure they're about to do that as well, that you push what would theoretically be considered how to be a good parent, just because I'm teaching young kids how to be a good person.
Ian?
Kessie just so beautifully articulated our entire strategy. Seriously, it's how do you norm and reward positive behaviors, especially in early education, because while we do interact with parents, you're question about parents' education, parents aren't the ones in our schools, right? I mean, we try to do as much as we can. We do home visits. There are a number of things that we do to engage families, but we have the kids. And so the more that we can weigh in advance of decisions like, should I have a child out of wedlock, we want to encourage being a good person, being responsible for my actions. It's sweating the small stuff, as some people call it. Much earlier on small decisions that give you the framework and the guidelines when you're considering these massive decisions.
So, first of all, I'm really happy with what Taisha said. That makes me very proud.
Yes.
Second, in terms of, so I'm actually a proud graduate of Montgomery County, Maryland Public Schools. So thank you for working there. I'm actually Kessie's godfather as of last night, which is one of the greatest honors of my life, really. But our families absolutely love their children and are fully committed to their success and want very deeply for them to have great outcomes and are super committed to getting them on the path or to and through college. And so middle school is difficult, and kids are often going through a difficult transition, right? There are different things that emerge, and as students come into themselves, there are things that they have to grapple with, and hormonal changes that the families aren't accustomed to. And so sometimes they do look to the school to say, what can I do? How can I help? What's going on with my daughter? So we very much have a role in terms of educating our families about the changes that they might expect, especially if this is their first adolescent. Very much a role in sharing what we're doing in the school to support their daughters and to support the community more generally. And then to share best practices where we know, but also to take a learning stance. So the families have known them for years and years. They have a lot to share with us about their individual child and what makes her tick and what we can do that will be most supportive.
So thank you. I would just add one thing on that. Parenting education is a subtopic in social policy, and the Nurse-Family Partnership Program is very much a parenting education. The A.I. Brookings Working Group report on poverty opportunity talked about helping to close achievement gaps between households and single-parent households and married families by improving the parenting going on in all households. And so I didn't think your question was going to lead to you guys agreeing to go back to home economics, but the topic is an important one, and I would like to thank our panelists. You all were outstanding in every way. Do you have anything further to say that you didn't get to say that you want to say?
Just thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. That's nice of you to say. Thank you, really, much more importantly. I would like to say that my fellow New Yorkers did very well, don't you think? And let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.